All right. Getting your EDM drops to hit hard can be a struggle, so today we're putting yours on a workout plan, using my track While It Lasts as an example, which dropped recently. I'll link a visualizer for it at the end of this video, but let's get into it. First of all, you have your cardio stage. This is the hyperactive portion that gets your blood pumping. It's exciting. It's a flurry of activity. That's just the getting an idea out into the DAW. It's exciting, and in this case, we're not even worried too much about strengthening the drop. We're just getting an idea on paper, so to speak. So for getting an idea down, I wouldn't worry too much about making it sound amazing, although you will be doing production and mixing as you go, probably. We can't help ourselves. Regardless, once you've got the rush of your cardio stage, let's get into some strength training for your drop. And once again, I'll be leaning on the song that I wanted to walk you through as an example, and it's very much kind of a cheesy melodic dubstep style track, but this should still apply pretty generally to a lot of styles of electronic music. So let's start with a core workout. And for the purposes of this, I'm defining your core as your drums and your bass. They are, after all, the core of your track that hold everything else up. A few things that I want to draw your attention to. First of all, simply choosing the right samples goes a really long way. And I say right samples. Of course, there are really no right or wrong samples in electronic music, just whatever fits your idea. But there are some genre conventions, like for instance, a trance kick might not work so well in a trap track and vice versa. And in this case, I'm using some virtual right and eliminate sounds. And I'm very intentionally using short, punchy sounds with some defined upper mids and transients that will really cut through the mix. And also I should mention, layered with that, I've chopped up this loop and processed it a good bit. So those claps are hitting just a little bit early. Basically just harvesting it for parts. And then later on, just for context, some hi-hats that ratchet the energy level up a notch halfway through the drop. Using some periphery drums for this, which is definitely overkill. And of course, the other part of our core is the bass. It's very important that at some point you check whether your kick and your bass are working really well together. Some people will tune the kick to the key of the song. Kind of depends on your kick and how bassy it is. But also, I've really tried to dial in my sidechain to leave a really well carved out pocket for the kick and the bass to both fit in. Also, this is a free plugin, Towel Filter, and I'm just shaping the volume here. This is a pretty good alternative to LFO Tool if you can't be bothered to shell out for that. And here's the other thing about dealing with your bass that beginning producers, including me when I was a beginner, get wrong all the time. In a track where you've got these big saw stacks, which we will get into in a second, but you've got these big saw stacks with all these highs and upper mids and maybe a big old lead, it's fairly tempting to just have kind of a low sub bass and call it a day, and then crank the volume of your upper mid heavy synths. But really, if you listen to a lot of professional tracks that have big chord stacks, their basses are actually even bigger, or at least comparable. So you'll often have, under the big saw stacks, this surprisingly loud, gritty saw bass. And that actually goes a long way towards the foundation of your track. There's a good reason I'm calling it the core here. So in this case, yes, it's got some sub to it, but this bass is just fairly gritty on its own, and there's also some width to it. So you've already got a good bit of mids and upper mids to it before we even bring in the other elements. Like, it can't necessarily exist on its own, but it's close. It is holding the track up, shall we say. Next up, let's work on your upper body, which are, for the purposes of this, your chord stacks. Now in this case, I'm doing these in pigments because they have some really nice supersaw modes, but of course, a supersaw can be created in pretty much anything. So in this case, I've got the detune a bit of the way up. I've got the unison mode set to super, stereo turned all the way up for some nice width. And I've got just the one oscillator here and then a separate oscillator. And you'll notice they're at different octaves. And this is absolutely key to getting good saw stacks. When I first started on this track, I just had a lower stack. So let me sew this along with the kick and bass. It sounds fairly dull and lifeless. And then we add in that upper octave, which is just the same chord stack, but an octave up. So a couple things to kind of prove my point. Here's what happens if I get rid of the lower octave. It sounds really thin and hollow. And if I get rid of the big old bass, or say cut all its highs and maybe turn it down a bit, doesn't have nearly the same impact. It's supporting the chord stack quite a bit. So yeah, you want your upper body to be big, noticeable, and impressive for the purposes of this overstretched metaphor. And of course, we want you to be well-rounded, so we've added some pads as well. Here's without. And let me solo those. Just a nice subtle little pad. This is Venus Theory's decent sampler patch from Organic Orchestra. And then another Pigments patch. Just filling out the gaps, making it sound a lot more lush. And I've muted the leads to tell you that, of course, you need to take rests between sets. So that's what we've done with these chord stacks. We're taking rests between sets. And that contrast between the periods of intense activity and the periods where there's some more gaps left really helps the loud periods hit a lot harder. Same deal with like high passing all of your elements in a build right before a drop or something like that. And in this case, I have filled these little gaps with drum fills. You might also fill those with bass growls, for instance. And then immediately cut them off because those toms rang out quite a bit. So I mentioned the lead. We're going to get into that next because for the purposes of this overstretched metaphor, these are your biceps. They're the part that really stand out. So this is a serum patch. I actually struggled quite a bit with getting one that had the tone that was right for this already fairly cheesy melody and didn't make it sound too cheesy. And I ended up going with something with some kind of phasiness, this little bit of movement, and I've set an LFO to define pitch that kicks in over time. So the longer a note is held down, the more its pitch warbles. And it's still fairly in your face, but there's a little bit of reverb and delay on it. And then for context layered with that, I've got a piano. Gets a little percussive nature, fills it out. And often I'll sidechain a lead less to the kick, but I'll sidechain a little bit. In this case, I just elected not to do it at all. So once again, like your bulging biceps, I do want it to stand out quite a bit. And of course, friends don't let friends skip leg day, so let's make sure that we pay attention to our low end. Actually, in this case, this is an alternate universe where people go way too hard on leg day, and in this case, put too much bass in their mix. I've been vibing on bass room lately as a way to better dial in my bass and find muddy frequencies and cut them, or find frequencies that increase punch without adding mud and emphasize them. It's subtle in this case, but it does make an improvement, so check this out. See, I can cut that a bunch without really even hurting the mix. Or I could maybe emphasize this a bit. See, probably not that, but maybe that. I have to be careful with this, obviously, but hopefully you get the idea. And of course, while doing this process, while mixing stuff, while getting the balance of my bass versus my supersaws versus my lead, while trying to master it to get the bass to hit hard but not be overwhelming, pay attention to what others are doing. I referenced this against quite a few other tracks because, after all, if you don't watch what other people are doing and copy their good form, you might hurt yourself. Or, in this case, your listeners. Now that we've absolutely beat this metaphor to death, a couple other things I want to show you that are not completely related, just related to the track. I've got a couple of layers of this ARP here in the beginning. So a couple of pigments patches. And I just manually programmed this ARP. I've got some automation on this and crystalline as well. Come on. The nice little bit crusher on this. And we wash them out as we prepare to get into the drop. Filter in my supersaws. And that takes us nicely into the drop. And finally, I mixed the vocals in a separate session.
The city lights shimmer from afar. I take a breath, take in the scene.
So there's a subtle harmony layered under here.
The city lights shimmer from afar.
And I kind of mixed and matched when there were or weren't harmony layers. Like in this case, I actually intentionally took out the harmony because I wanted the vocal to stand on its own. In this case, I have a slightly louder harmony, but then ducked down the very last word of it.
But I know everything could change, leaving this moment in the past.
Then we go back into the harmonized version.
I'm terrified of what might be in the future.
And then another isolated vocal. And you can see I've done just a subtle bit of retiming here and there, especially on the harmonies, just to get them to really, really line up with the lead. But let me get into the lead processing real quick. I went through a few iterations on this. First of all, some EQ.
Lights shimmer from afar.
You don't need all that extra low end in the context of a mix.
Shimmer from afar.
Subtle compressor. Okay, a non-subtle compressor. A tiny bit of OTT.
I take a breath, take in the scene.
I've always struggled with de-essers. I do want to say, though, one telltale sign of an amateur vocal mix is harsh sibilance, the S's and T's. And so I added de-essers, and that still wasn't quite doing it for me. So literally, I went ahead and just manually did some volume shaping on S's and T's.
The city lights shimmer from afar.
And there are a couple of pops and clicks that I also edited out. It sounds kind of absurd, isolated, but the reverb helps smooth that out a bit.
The city lights shimmer from afar.
So a nice reverb and delay with some reverse and ping-ponging going. A little more EQ.
The city lights shimmer from afar.
And then a limiter because that was getting pretty quiet.
I take a breath, take in the scene.
So there's no processing.
The city lights shimmer from afar.
And that just floats nicely over the top of the mix.
The city lights shimmer from afar.
So if you'd like to hear the full song and see the dope visualizer for it, you can click or tap up over here. And if you'd like to see some more music production stuff, you can click or tap up over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.